The Virginia night lay heavy, silvered by moonlight. A line of freshly washed clothes swayed in the breeze, the fabric whispering like ghosts. From the mansion, muffled cries rose into sudden, piercing screams. Flames snapped in the hearth, their glow leaking through the windows, painting the curtains blood red. Chains clinked somewhere in the dark. Wood groaned as though the house itself recoiled. A clock tolled midnight, each chime a nail in the silence. Over it all a lullaby drifted, sweet once, now warped into a dirge. The voice came cold, measured. The poison was stitched into their very skin. By dawn, the great house would never breathe the same again. The war was over. Drums had fallen silent from Yorktown to Boston, but Tidewater, Virginia still carried the sound of chains. Freedom had been promised in speeches, written in proclamations, toasted in taverns. Yet here on the Whitlock plantation, the air was heavy with the same old tyranny. The sugar mill roared through the nights, a beast of iron and smoke that chewed men down to bone and left their cries swallowed in the whir of gears. Elias Rowe limped through the yard at dawn, his back hunched like a question mark carved by years of cruelty. The whip dangled from his hand, not as a tool but as an extension of his body. Each step struck the packed dirt with the same measured rhythm as the lash. He muttered as he walked, voice gravel in the throat. Lazy hands breed lies, and lies breed the rope. Two young boys hauling sacks of cane froze, eyes wide. Elias didn't strike them, he didn't need to. The sight of his crooked frame, the way the whip tapped against his boot spoke enough. From the big house, soft humming floated into the air. A hymn, low and steady, carrying over the clatter of buckets and the hiss of steam. Martha Bell, the housemaid, moved like a shadow through the back porch, balancing a tray of linens. She sang under her breath as though it were the only prayer she dared keep alive. Elias scowled. "Quiet that noise, girl." She lowered her gaze, but her lips never stopped moving, the tune shrinking into a whisper only she could hear. The plantation seemed frozen in time, untouched by the victory banners waving across the new nation. Colonists shouted of liberty in town squares, but on this land liberty was a word that could get you killed. The enslaved carried rumors like embers in their pockets, embers of uprisings in Jamaica, of freedom ships that sailed out of Norfolk, of promises made by generals who vanished after the smoke cleared. At dusk, Martha found herself behind the kitchen house, shaking out scraps of cloth left in a barrel. Most were stained with dye, stiff from drying. One strip caught her eye, strange, darker than the rest, its threads brittle. She rubbed it between her fingers. The texture was wrong, as though the fabric carried something more than dye. She lifted it to her nose. A bitter scent clung to it, sharp and sweet at once, almonds gone rancid. Her fingers trembled. She glanced toward the house, toward Elias's silhouette pacing near the barn. She pressed the scrap into her apron pocket, humming louder now, the hymn no longer a whisper but a shield. She said nothing, not to Elias, not to the cook, not even to herself. The narrator's voice returned, soft as the wind through the cane fields. They all breathed the same poisoned air, but some had already begun to stitch rebellion into silence. The Whitlock plantation was a kingdom of iron rules and silken cruelty. Children were born into it, raised on the rhythm of the mill, the sting of the lash, the shadow of the house that towered like a courthouse over every life. Louisa was one of those children. She learned early that silence could be stitched into cloth, that a needle could carry secrets. At 8 years old, she sat cross-legged on the floor of the weaving shed, candlelight flickering across her face. The older women bent over their work, hands moving quick, voices hushed. Louisa's fingers clutched a bent thimble, the metal worn thin. Her mother pressed it into her palm before slipping away into the fields. "Keep it close, Louisa," she whispered. "A stitch can outlive a chain." That night, Louisa drove the needle through fabric and caught her finger instead. Blood welled up, smeared across the thread, staining the tiny seam. She didn't cry. She pulled the thread through again, watching red blend into the cloth like a hidden mark only she could see. The bent thimble never left her hand after that. Her brother Samuel was 3 years younger, always chasing after her shadow, always with pockets full of feathers. Bright ones, speckled ones, ragged ones. He plucked them from the yard or found them tangled in cane stalks. He believed they were signs. "One day we'll fly, Lou," he said, pressing a crow's feather behind his ear. "They say if you reach the James River, there are ships that carry folks north." "Free ships?" Louisa only looked at him, her needle moving in and out of fabric. You keep talking like that and Elias will hang you higher than the barn. But Samuel grinned wide and unafraid. Birds don't hang. They saw. It was Samuel who saw their father's back torn open by Elias Rowe's whip. The overseer's crooked spine bent with each swing, his face twisted with relish. Samuel stood at the edge of the yard, too young to be working yet, clutching his feathers to his chest. The cries of his father rose and fell, but over them came bird song from the trees, clear, mocking, as if nature itself refused to bend to pain. Samuel never forgot the way those sounds mixed. Lash, scream, birdsong. He carried them like a melody that haunted him into manhood. Louisa worked her way into the great house, chosen for her nimble fingers and quick stitches. She could turn worn fabric into something nearly new, sew lace without tearing, hem a dress to fit perfectly. Madame Anne Whitlock liked that. Anne was a woman untouched by labor. Her skin pale as cream, hands soft as butter, voice sharp as glass. She swept through the halls in silk gowns, perfume trailing behind her, her smile as cold as her gaze. When she found Louisa's stitches flawless, she laughed, a tinkling sound that rang across the parlor. "Look at this, Elias," she once called. "The girl has hands finer than my own seamstress in Williamsburg. Perhaps I should hire her out to the governor's wife." Louisa lowered her eyes. Praise from Anne was a knife wrapped in ribbon, because when the stitch was crooked, when Louisa's hand trembled from hunger or exhaustion, Anne's smile turned. Her lips curled back, her voice struck like a whip itself. "Tear it out. Again, if you must bleed, then bleed on the cloth. I'll not have rags in my house." And if the mistake was too visible, Anne would order punishment, never by her own hand, but always with her command. She would sip her wine as Elias struck, her soft fingers never stained. Louisa learned then, beauty was not protection. Praise was a trap. The chain rattled no matter how fine the seam. At night she sat by the window of the quarters, her bent thimble pressed into her palm. Samuel lay beside her, tracing a feather across his arm. Outside the mill clanked and hissed, smoke curling into the stars. "Sing it, Lou," Samuel whispered. So she sang the lullaby their mother used to hum, the melody soft, meant to soothe. But in Louisa's voice it carried something darker, a thread of defiance sewn into every note. Chains rattled outside. The mill roared. Yet within that small song, the siblings stitched a secret. They were more than what the house believed, and in Madame Anne's laughter, in Elias's lash, in the bent thimble cutting into her palm, Louisa began to understand the truth. A seam could hold more than cloth. A seam could hold memory, or vengeance. The narrator's voice settled over the scene. Children on the Whitlock estate were taught early. Pain was a language, praise a lie, and silence the only shield. But even silence can be broken if someone dares to stitch their name into the fabric of history. The nights on the plantation were heavier than the days. Heat lingered, pressing against the walls, making every breath thick with sugar dust and smoke. But for Louisa, night was when the world truly spoke. She often crept to the back of the quarters, where Isaac sat on a wooden stool, his Bible worn to tatters, its spine cracked, pages torn and thumbed until they nearly dissolved. Isaac was no preacher anymore, at least not aloud. The law had stripped him of sermons, the overseer of pulpits, but his voice still carried that rhythm, that rise and fall of prophecy. "Read this, child," he murmured, running a finger over faint black letters. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Louisa squinted, tracing the words with her bent thimble as though the metal itself could carve meaning into her mind. Her lips stumbled over the syllables. "I shall not want." Isaac nodded, eyes glinting in the dark. "You'll learn faster than most. Just remember, words can save, or they can hang you higher than the gallows." He coughed, shoulders shuddering. His hands were cracked, scarred, yet gentle as he slid the Bible back into the folds of his coat. Samuel sat close, feathers tucked behind his ear, listening as if the very letters were wings that might carry them away. "Tell it again," he whispered. "About the ships, Isaac, the ones that sail free." Isaac's eyes softened, but his voice turned heavy. "The world beyond the James holds freedom for some, chains for others. Don't go chasing every bird you see. Some are hawks waiting to strike." Louisa leaned in, her voice low. "But if we could, if we had a way—" Isaac touched her hand, the thimble cold between them. "Patience, child. Even fire starts from a spark too small to see. It was Isaac who first noticed her secret stitches. She had begun marking cloth with symbols, tiny patterns inside seams no one else would notice, lines that looked like mistakes but weren't. A cross for faith, a bird for Samuel, a flame for her anger. Careful with that needle, Isaac warned. It's speaking louder than you know. But Louisa only pressed her lips tight and kept sewing. The threat came soon after. Thomas Calhoun rode into the yard on a grey horse, his coat unbuttoned, his boots splattered with drink and mud, his face flushed red from rum, his words slurred but sharp as nails. He was known among the enslaved as a man who bought not for work, but for his own pleasures. Girls, mostly barely grown. He carried a silver coin that he tapped against his thigh, each clink a promise of barter. Madame Anne met him on the porch, her laughter lilting, brittle. "You ride in at ungodly hours, Mr. Calhoun." "Ungodly hours suit me fine," he said, swaying as he dismounted. His eyes scanned the yard like a butcher at market. Louisa stood among the laundry lines, her hands frozen on the cloth. Calhoun's gaze landed on her, slid down her frame, lingered. He smiled with teeth yellowed from tobacco. "That one," he muttered. "Quick hands, quick eyes." Anne followed his look, then smirked. "She is useful here. A fine seamstress. Still, everything has a price." Louisa's stomach twisted. She lowered her head, needle slipping from her hand. The thimble clinked softly against the wash basin. That night she crept close to the great house where the windows glowed with lamplight. Voices drifted through the shutters. "Her skin's clear," Calhoun was saying, his words oiled with rum. "She'd fetch more than coin, if you know what I mean." Anne's voice, cool and clipped. "I won't part with her easily. She keeps my gowns sharper than silk. But perhaps if the price is right." Louisa pressed her ear to the wood, the boards rough against her cheek. Her breath came quick, her fists balled tight. Samuel found her there, whispering, "Lou? What is it?" She dragged him away, eyes burning. "Nothing. Go back." But the words she heard stitched themselves into her like a curse. Her fate was not her own. It belonged to hands soft from never working, to men drunk on sugar and rum. Back in the quarters, Isaac saw the storm on her face. "What did you hear?" Louisa stared at her thimble, the metal glinting like a blade. "Enough to know," she said quietly. "If I don't stitch my own path, someone else will sell it." The narrator's voice whispered like the wind over the cane. Freedom was a rumor, escape a song. But Louisa was learning that silence could not hold her forever. A needle can clothe, a needle can mark, and if sharpened with fury, a needle can kill. The morning broke heavy with storm clouds, pressing the fields into silence. Word had spread before the sun fully rose. Samuel was gone. They said he had taken a lump of sugar no bigger than his palm, stolen from the mill. Anne Whitlock herself had given the order. Her lips curled as though the boy's hunger was an insult to her very name. Elias Rowe had carried it out, each lash deliberate, steady, until Samuel's body sagged and would not rise again. They left him near the sugar mill, his feathers scattered from his pocket, black against the white dust of crushed cane. Louisa found him first. She knelt beside him, her hand trembling as it brushed his hair from his brow. His eyes were open, staring skyward, but no bird would come to carry him away. Anne appeared in the doorway of the big house, a glass of wine in hand, though the hour was still early. Her voice carried like a whip. "A boy who steals sweet things will rot in bitter ground." Louisa did not look up. Her fingers closed around Samuel's last feather, bent and broken. Its shaft split down the middle. Martha Bell stood at a distance, her hymn rising soft and mournful, a tune too fragile for the air. Other enslaved gathered in silence, their faces carved from stone, their grief buried beneath years of punishment. None dared speak. Elias Rowe leaned against his whip, eyes flat, unmoved. The twisted curve of his back seemed to mock the boy's small, straight frame, stretched out on the dirt. Louisa pressed Samuel's feather into her palm until it snapped. Still she did not weep. Her voice came low, a whisper only the earth could hear. "Then I will feed her bitterness." That night in the quarters, the women wrapped Samuel's body in rough cloth. No preacher was allowed. Isaac bowed his head, lips moving silently as if even prayer was forbidden. They dug shallow ground near the mill, the soil clotted and sour from years of spilled blood and sweat. No words were spoken. The shovel scraped, the body lowered. The hymn hummed, that was all. Louisa stood apart, her bent thimble clutched tight in her fist. Her eyes did not blink. Her face did not break. Only the chain of her silence shifted, link by link, into something harder. When the last handful of dirt fell, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. In the darkness, Louisa returned to her needle. She lit a stub of candle, its flame trembling. She pulled thread through the thimble and cloth, though her hands shook not with grief, but with a fury sharpened to a point. She sewed the first stitch that night, the narrator's voice whispered. Not in cloth, but in vengeance. The cloth caught a drop of wax, hardened into a scar across the seam. Louisa stared at it, seeing not fabric but the face of Madame Anne, pale and cruel, laughing with wine on her lips. Every stitch that followed was slower, deeper, each pull of the thread an oath unspoken. The lullaby she hummed to herself twisted into something new, no longer a comfort but a dirge, a warning, a promise. Outside, the sugar mill groaned and clanked, indifferent, endless. But inside Louisa a fire had been lit, a fire that would not die until it consumed. The fields ripened in heat, the cane tall, sharp as blades. The air itself felt thick with waiting. Samuel's burial left a scar no whip could erase. But Louisa carried her grief like a hidden needle, sharp and silent. She bent over her work in the dim light of the quarters, the bent thimble pressing into her fingertip, each stitch drawing her deeper into thought. At night, whispers spread. Some said spirits stirred near the mill. Others swore they had seen Louisa walk with her head too high, her eyes too steady. In the old quarters, Nana Ruth sat grinding leaves and roots, her fingers blackened by years of tending herbs. She spoke low, a rasp worn by time. "Child," she said as Louisa entered, "poison don't just kill the body, it stains the soul. You ready to carry that mark?" Louisa's hand trembled only once, before she set Samuel's broken feather on the table between them. She left her mark first. "Mine will answer." Nana Ruth studied her, then pushed a small pouch forward. Inside was the brittle scent of almonds, sharp and bitter. You soak it slow. Thread takes the taste, holds it, but you keep your breath short while you work. One mistake, and your lungs will close before the sun. Louisa nodded, the thimble cool in her palm. By day, she bent her head in the Whitlock house, her needle flashing, her lullabies soft. Madame Anne drifted through the rooms like a queen surveying subjects. She stopped behind Louisa one morning, her silk skirts brushing the floor. "Girl," Anne said sharply, "the family will host a supper in 2 weeks' time. I will need new gowns. Strong seams. No mistakes." Her lips curled in a smile too sharp for her soft hands. "You do your stitches well, Louisa. Almost as if you were born for it." Louisa kept her eyes on the cloth, her breath even. "Yes, madam." She did not add, born perhaps to end it. In the stables, Peter worked with the horses, his hands gentle on the reins. He watched Louisa pass, her face shadowed with thoughts he could not name. He followed once after dusk when she carried water from the well. "Louisa," he whispered, stepping close. His voice carried a quiet ache. "You've been walking like a storm's in your chest." "I know the look." "Just tell me," she hesitated. "If I speak it, Peter, it becomes yours too. And you ain't meant to carry it." His hand brushed hers, calloused and warm. "I'd carry worse if it was yours." But she pulled away, slipping into the dark. Some burdens had no place for love. One evening, Elias Rowe's shadow fell long across the floor. Louisa froze where she crouched, dipping a cloth into a steaming pot of bitter brew. The air reeked of crushed leaves, sharp as iron. Rowe's cane tapped the doorframe. His bent spine twisted him into something less than a man, yet more dangerous for it. "What's that you're brewing?" His voice rasped like rope. Louisa's mind raced. She turned, her hands steady, and held up the cloth. "Soap water, sir. Madame Anne said the linens were dull." He squinted, nostrils flaring at the strange scent, then snorted. "Don't waste time with pretty smells. Soap is for their skin, not their souls." He moved on, his whip tapping the ground like a serpent's tail. Louisa exhaled only when the sound faded. Sunday brought Reverend Jonas Harper, his white collar crisp, his Bible worn. He stood in the Whitlock parlor, sunlight striking the dust around him like falling ash. His sermon wound through sin and obedience, his voice steady, righteous. "Slavery is ordained," he declared, his hand trembling on the pulpit. "Yet the Lord sees rebellion. He sees poison in the heart as surely as in the cup, and he will not forgive." His eyes swept the room and rested on Louisa longer than the others. She held his gaze without flinching. For a breath, silence pressed too heavy. Then his words stumbled forward again. After the service, Martha Bell whispered to her in the hall, him humming low under her breath. "He knows something. Best be careful, child." But Louisa only tightened her grip on her thimble. That night she worked by candlelight, dipping thread into the bitter brew, lifting it, letting it dry. Each strand looked harmless, yet carried death within its weave. She stitched slowly. Each pull a vow, each knot a prayer turned curse. Her lullaby carried through the air, sweet at first, then bending, twisting. It was no cradle song now. It was a dirge stitched into silk, a promise stitched into every seam. By the time dawn broke, 3 gowns lay folded, their beauty untouched, their danger hidden deep. Madame Anne would wear her own ending, sewn by the girl she had praised, punished, and overlooked. Louisa sat back, the thimble pressed against her palm. Samuel's feather rested beside her needle, broken but no longer silent. The Whitlock house blazed with light that July night. Candles crowded the long dining table, their flames bending in the humid air, dripping wax like slow tears. Silver gleamed. Crystal chimed. Laughter filled the parlor, brittle and rehearsed. Richmond gentry leaned close, their words heavy with politics and wine. Colonel Whitlock presided, a man broad in chest, flushed in pride. He wore his uniform despite the war's end, buttons polished bright, his voice booming. "Virginia will rise again," he declared. "The rebels may boast of liberty, but they cannot strip the loyal spirit from this land." His wife sat beside him, poised in her new gown of cream and blue, the seams tight as chains. Madame Anne's hand lifted her goblet with practiced grace. A pearl at her throat gleamed against skin that seemed too pale, too fragile in the flickering light. At her other side, Clara clutched her doll, its porcelain face cracked, its dress stained. She hummed softly, an echo of lullabies carried through the house. In the corner shadows, Louisa stood near the doorframe, silent. No one noticed her, just a seamstress, a servant, a shadow. Yet her gaze burned on the seams, the knots, the threads woven with poison. Every movement of silk against flesh was a prayer answered. Forks struck porcelain. The sound sharpened, louder than conversation, louder than laughter. The clatter seemed to echo inside Louisa's head. Sweat broke on Madame Anne's neck, glistening beneath candlelight. "Anne," the colonel said, leaning toward her, "you look flushed. Are you unwell?" She lifted her napkin to her lips, then pressed it harder as a cough tore from her chest. Her hand trembled. "It is warm," she whispered. Across the table, a child coughed. Clara, small hands clutching her doll tighter, bent forward. A hush fell. Guests looked at one another, frowns replacing their smiles. Another cough, harsher. Then the sound of a chair scraping back. Madame Anne clawed at her collar. Her voice cracked into a scream. "The seams, they burn!" She staggered to her feet, silk tearing as she pulled at the gown. Red welts bloomed across her throat, her arms as though the fabric itself seared her skin. The poison seeped in with each frantic tug. Gasps filled the room. Dishes shattered to the floor. Colonel Whitlock rose, his voice booming with panic now, not pride. "Anne! Anne!" Clara's cough turned into choking. Her small hands rose to her throat, doll falling limp onto the floorboards. The sound was too fragile, too wrong. Louisa's breath caught, her hand clutching the thimble in her pocket until it cut her skin. This was not meant for the child. "No," Louisa whispered, a word no one heard. Chaos erupted. Guests stumbled back, overturning chairs, their fine clothes catching candle flame as servants rushed with water. Some fled the room, their shoes striking wood in panicked rhythm. Elias Rowe shoved through the crowd, whip cane striking against the floor. His bent frame loomed larger in the confusion. His eyes darted, sharp as knives. He seized Martha Bell, dragging her forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's her," he roared. "The girl's always humming over pots, over cloth. She's poisoned them." Martha's hymn faltered into silence as his hand closed around her arm. Her wide eyes searched the room, pleading but unspoken. Louisa pressed deeper into shadow, trembling. She could hear Clara's gasps, high, desperate. Each sound pierced through her resolve. She had stitched vengeance, but vengeance did not choose its victims clean. Colonel Whitlock knelt beside his wife, his voice breaking. "Hold, Anne, hold!" Her lips foamed, her eyes wide with terror. Her nails dug bloody furrows into the silk, as if to rip the gown from her flesh. Her scream tore the air. Guests backed away, their whispers colliding. What devilry is this? God have mercy! The cloth itself kills them. Reverend Harper stumbled in from the hall, Bible in hand, his face pale. He shouted over the din, "This is judgment! Judgment upon this house!" His words rang, but his eyes flicked to the servants, to Louisa's corner. Did he know? Martha Bell struggled against Ro's grip. "I done nothing," she cried. "Lord bear witness, I done nothing." Ro raised the whip, ready to mark her as guilty. Louisa's breath came ragged. Her thimble cut deeper into her palm. Her eyes fixed on Clara, the child collapsing beside her mother, tiny body heaving. Innocence poisoned by threads meant for tyranny. The lullaby returned in Louisa's mind, twisted into a dirge, a cradle song of death. Her knees buckled, yet she did not step forward. To reveal herself was to lose everything, perhaps even the vengeance Samuel's memory demanded. She whispered again, only to herself, "Forgive me, little one." The room spiraled into panic. Servants carried pitchers, spilling water over burning gowns. Guests pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, as though fear itself could be caught in cloth. Colonel Whitlock shouted for order, his face streaming with sweat. Madame Anne collapsed, her pearl necklace snapping, beads scattering across the floor like tiny bones. Clara whimpered once more, then went silent against the chaos. The house groaned, the wood creaking as though chains rattled in its beams. From the shadows, Louisa watched what she had wrought. Silk and poison, beauty turned curse, vengeance sewn into every thread. Her heart thundered in triumph, then shattered in horror at the cost. For Samuel, for the lash, for every hymn smothered in chains, justice had come. But so had guilt, its weight heavier than iron. And still she did not step forward. She remained unseen. The thimble gleamed in her bloodied palm as screams filled the Virginia night. The night of the supper burned itself into the walls of the Whitlock house. Ash from the candles marked the ceilings. Pearls lay scattered still, rolling into corners where no hand dared touch them. And silence settled like a shroud, broken only by the creak of boards and the sobs of servants scrubbing blood and bile from the floor. Colonel Whitlock survived. His skin bore angry welts where fabric had kissed him, and his lungs rattled when he breathed. But pride held him upright, wrapped in bandages. His face was a mask of fury. Madame Anne did not rise again. Her final shriek had carried down the plantation road, and slaves whispered they still heard it at night, tangled with the cicadas. Clara lay in her chamber, pale as linen, her breath shallow. The child clutched her doll even in unconsciousness. The poison had not claimed her swiftly, only bound her in a half-life, her throat raw, her small body shivering in fever. Elias Rowe prowled the quarters like a wolf scenting blood. His bent spine made him lurch, whip cane striking the dirt, his voice snapping in the night. "Someone sewed death into the cloth," he bellowed, "and I will drag the devil into light if I must tear this place apart seam by seam." He seized Martha Bell first. She had been seen in the sewing room, humming, always humming. He shoved her into the great hall, her wrists bound. Her hands smell of herbs, he spat. "She's the witch behind it." Martha trembled, but did not beg. She looked only at Louisa, who stood silent among the other servants. A hymn quivered at the edge of her lips, then died before it could leave her tongue. Isaac was taken next, his Bible ripped from his hands, pages scattering in the yard like broken wings. Rowe struck him with the whip cane until blood streaked his beard. "You've been whispering rebellion in their ears," Rowe growled. "Your psalms are poison enough." Isaac only lifted his swollen eyes to the sky and murmured, "The Lord sees." The trial came quickly. Judge Pembroke rode in, his black robe trailing dust, his gavel heavy in hand. He was a stern man, his plantation larger than the Whitlocks, his slaves numbering in the hundreds. To him, the law was not justice, but order. In the courthouse, sunlight slanted through high windows, striking the wooden floor where stains of past punishments lingered. Colonel Whitlock sat grim and silent, his daughter absent, his grief hidden behind fury. Martha Bell stood accused. Elias roared her guilt. The Reverend Harper muttered about women who consort with herbs. Judge Pembroke nodded, barely hearing. The words for the verdict was already written before the trial began. "Martha Bell," he declared, "you are sentenced to death by hanging to be carried out before sunset tomorrow." May your body serve as warning. Her hymn broke free at last, soft, trembling, cut short as the guards dragged her away. Isaac never saw the courtroom. He died in the jailhouse, his body beaten until breath no longer came. His psalms were silenced, his wisdom buried under bruises. The other prisoners whispered that his lips kept moving even after death, mouthing verses to a God he never betrayed. The floorboards of the jail drank his blood, the smell of iron heavy in the air. Among the enslaved, whispers stirred like wind through cane. They sang soft songs in the fields, their voices low so overseers would not hear. She sowed their death in silence, they murmured. She stitched justice with her mother's thimble. She is a shadow, half saint, half witch. Louisa's name was never spoken loud. It became a phantom carried in lullabies, the melody warped from cradle song to morning chant. Some feared her, others revered her, but none betrayed her. By night, Louisa sat alone with her needle, her hands trembling. She saw Clara's face whenever she closed her eyes. The child's cough haunted her more than Anne's scream. She touched Samuel's feather, stained now with her own blood, and whispered, "I didn't mean her." The thimble pressed into her palm, heavier than iron. Richard Hale sat at the back of the courthouse, his quill scratching. A young journalist, not yet hardened by the world, he wore plain clothes and asked few questions. His notes filled with fragments. Silk seams, poison breath, child gasping. Child. He recorded whispers from the quarters. The hymns turned dirges. The fear laced with pride. He knew his words might never see print. Editors feared stories that hinted at rebellion, but he wrote them anyway. For the future, for some paper yet unborn, for some ear yet ready. The execution drew a crowd. Martha Bell stood on the scaffold, her hymn humming low, her face lifted to the sky. Chains rattled as the noose tightened. The crowd watched in silence, some with pity, most with indifference. Louisa stood among them, her face unreadable, her fists clenched. She hummed the hymn too under her breath, so soft no one heard. The rope snapped. Martha fell. The hymn ended. Blood stained the courtroom floor. Blood stained the jail. And the Whitlock house echoed with silence, where once there had been laughter and pride. Louisa remained undiscovered. Yet every night when Clara coughed in her chamber, Louisa felt the weight of her vengeance pressing down. Samuel's face came to her in dreams, but so did the child's. The lullabies twisted still, sung in the fields, drifting through cane. They were no longer songs of sleep, they were songs of memory, of loss, of warning. And Louisa stitched by candlelight, her hands steady, her heart breaking, the thimble gleaming with secrets no trial could ever uncover. The Whitlock estate never shook free of the night when silk turned to shroud. Its windows seemed darker, its halls colder. Guests no longer lingered there, and neighbors crossed themselves when they passed along the road. For white society, the story became a warning, reshaped by fear. They whispered of the poisoned seamstress, a shadow that stitched death into gowns, a demon with needle and thread. Mothers hushed their daughters with tales of her, cautioning them never to trust the hands of a servant too skilled with cloth. But the enslaved carried the tale differently. Around fires and in fields, the story slipped into song. A lullaby, twisted yet sweet, spread among quarters. Stitch by stitch the chain will break. Thread of blood, thread of fate. They did not speak Louisa's name openly. Her name was a secret, a spark too dangerous to hold in plain sight. Instead, she was called the singer, or the seamstress of shadows. In her story, vengeance became. Justice and the bent thimble she carried became a relic whispered about. Passed hand to hand, seamstress to seamstress, hidden in hems and linings. Each woman who touched it felt the weight of her defiance. Clara Whitlock grew older, though she never truly healed. Her breath rattled in the night, her throat scarred by invisible fingers. She told friends, and later her own children, that she felt phantom stitches crawling across her skin when the house grew quiet. She swore she could hear humming in the halls, a lullaby that began gently and then soured into mourning. Servants shivered when she spoke of it, for they too had heard a hum where no singer stood. Her memories blurred, but one truth clung to her. She feared her mother's gown. In dreams, She saw silk crawling with red welts, threads burning like fire. She never wore a handmade dress again without trembling. Years later, Richard Hale, the young journalist who had sat in Judge Pembroke's courtroom, printed fragments of the story. He could not name Louisa. Fear of reprisal was too sharp and he had no proof, but his words hinted. He wrote of the poisoned seams, of the child's gasp, of a servant girl whose song was never heard again. His story was part truth, part rumor, part legend. But it spread. In taverns, men muttered of rebellion hiding in cloth. In parlors, women tugged uneasily at their sleeves. In the quarters, enslaved men and women folded his words into their songs, weaving them with memory. Decades passed. The revolution faded into history, but the tale endured. In Tidewater, Virginia, whenever a planter's wife sickened unexpectedly, the slaves would glance at one another and whisper, "Louisa's thread." If a child grew pale without cause, the same word stirred, "Louisa's thread." It was never spoken as curse alone, but also as prayer. To some it meant hope, that justice could bloom even from silence, even from the smallest hands. To others it meant fear, that vengeance did not care whom it touched, innocent or guilty. The bent thimble survived. It slipped from pocket to pocket, hidden in rags carried to other plantations, passed down to daughters and granddaughters. Each bearer knew its story, though the details shifted like smoke. Some said Louisa had sung her poison into the gowns. Others swore she stitched psalms backwards to bind the devil himself into the seams. None knew for certain, but they held the thimble close, its rusted curve pressing into their skin, and they remembered. So the legend of the poisoned seamstress walked two worlds at once. For whites, a tale of terror. For the enslaved, a hymn of resistance. It lived in lullabies, in whispers, in trembling silk. And long after Louisa's hands had stilled, her stitches remained, phantom seams across Virginia's memory, binding past to present. Grief to defiance, because every thread she pulled had carried more than cloth. It had carried vengeance. It had carried hope. And for decades, whenever a seam split or a gown tightened too cruelly, someone somewhere would murmur, "Louisa's thread." Louisa stitched silence into screams. She proved that even the smallest tool, a needle, could unmake an empire's illusions. In a world where chains bound flesh and law-bound souls, her thimble became sharper than any sword. Each seam she sewed was a wound opened in the Whitlock's pride, each knot a defiance against a system built to break her. Yet vengeance carries its own weight. Louisa did not choose Clara, but the thread did not distinguish between tyrant and child. In her rebellion, she pricked the skin of innocence. The poison that burned Anne's throat also stole the breath of a girl too young to wield a whip, too young to order pain. Louisa's hand carried justice, but also guilt. So what then is justice in a world like that? Is it the cry of the oppressed finally echoing through the halls of power? Or is it another chain of blood, binding victim and avenger alike? The lullabies tell both stories. For the enslaved, Louisa's name was hope, a reminder that even a woman bent to the needle could bend fate itself. For the Whitlocks, her name became a curse, whispered to frightened daughters in the night. Memory kept her alive. Oppression birthed her defiance. Guilt shadowed her legacy. And rebellion, quiet, stitched, and deadly, became the mark she left behind. History rarely tells of Louisa. The records name only Martha Bell, Isaac, the Whitlocks. But legends are stubborn. They hum through chains, they rattle in hymn. They stitch themselves into the very seams of memory. And Louisa remains there, bent thimble in hand, forever poised between justice and sin. If you were Louisa bound by chains, her brother buried in bitter ground, her hands pressed into endless labor, what would you have done? Would you forgive? Let silence swallow injustice, let the whip carve its mark again and again? Or would you take the needle in your palm, thread dipped in bitterness, and stitch your vengeance into every seam, no matter the cost? Louisa's story leaves no easy answers. Justice and guilt bled together that night, tangled as tightly as silk and thread. The Whitlocks fell, but so did innocence. History remembers her not in ledgers or court records, but in whispers, in lullabies that still hum in Virginia's soil. So I leave you with the question, was Louisa a murderer, a martyr, or something in between? I want to hear your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Do you believe vengeance can ever be pure? Or does it always carry blood on its hands? If this story stirred you, if it made you question the hidden corners of history, then subscribe for more dark legends and untold truths. Share this with someone who dares to answer the question, forgive or burn it all down.